Let's talk work. Most of us could do with a little bit more motivation and productivity, but at times hustle culture can feel a bit culty or take things too far. I'm usually not one to say that hard work is a bad thing, but when you have little time for anything else, you have to start wondering, what if you could get meaningful stuff done while still having a life? Luckily, the answers are out there. Okay, so I think right before we get into it, let's first take a step back all the way to 2019 when I first stumbled upon the world of productivity. At the time, I had just started my second year of dental school, but I was still quite unsure as to whether I actually wanted to do dentistry. And at that point, we still had the option of transferring over to medicine. So I really felt this pressure to figure out where I wanted to go. However, what I knew for certain was that I really enjoyed the work that we were studying in anatomy. But a month or two into that year, I overheard one of my seniors saying that if you really enjoy anatomy, you should think about going into surgery, since that's essentially just applied anatomy. So out of curiosity, I started reading a number of autobiographies written by surgeons to see what life as a surgeon would be like. At the time, it really put me off from considering a career as a surgeon, but what it instilled in me was this idea that if I wanted to make any kind of meaningful progress in whatever career I ended up in, I would need to put in the time and effort, which inevitably got me curious enough to pick up a book on self-development, which then turned into 2 and 3 and 5 and 10, and so it continued until I ended up reading over 140 books over the course of a few years, with topics ranging from health to wealth to happiness. But it was only really during my final year of study that I realized there was a cost to trying to be productive all the time, which is that when you're always working, there's little time and energy left for anything else in your life, which is why during the past 12 months, I made it a priority to spend more time with friends, make use of my holidays, and to just generally be more present. And you know what? During the past 12 months, I noticed that I wasn't actually any noticeably less productive compared to previous years. I realized that as long as I could stick to 4 basic principles, I could still get a lot done while still having a life. So without further ado, let's get into point number 1, the most important step. The most important step a man can take is the next one. Always the next one. So before we run around pouring our energy into anything and everything that looks interesting, we should really think about where is it that we are trying to go? What's the general direction that we're kind of trying to push our life in? Aimless work tends to lead to very little progress because it's hard to really move forward in a goal when you don't actually know how to get there. On top of that, it also just makes it a lot easier to know when to say yes and no to things, because all of a sudden you know what is moving you closer to where you want to be and what is moving you further away. For example, if you get home and you spend 2 hours scrolling online, if there's not really anything in particular that you're working on, then there's not really a cost to doing that. But if, for example, you wanted to get better grades and you wanted to study every day, then all of a sudden there's now a cost to that 2 hours of scrolling on social media, because you could have used that time to work on assignments or study for the next test or exam to get you closer to where you actually want to be. Which then brings us to the next point. If you have an idea of where it is you actually want to go, you now need to figure out how long that's actually going to take you. Number 2, Parkinson's law. Parkinson's law states that work will expand or shrink to fill the time allotted to its completion. For example, if you have an assignment and the assignment is only due in 2 weeks, chances are pretty high it's going to take you 2 weeks to submit that assignment. But if you forget about the assignment and you only remember about it the day before, then you'd be pretty surprised at how quickly you managed to get that assignment done. But this idea applies to a lot of things in our lives, especially when it comes to things like exercise or side projects. Essentially anything where you have a measure of control over how much time you're going to spend on it. if you don't control that time, it can just expand outward and eat up your entire day. So what has really helped me is to set limits on how long I'm going to be busy with a particular thing. If I tell myself I'm only going to work out for 1 hour and I'm only going to study for 2 hours that evening, then all of a sudden it adds a kind of structure to everything. And I know that, okay, it's only going to take me this long to do said activity. And you get to the end of the evening finding that you still have a bit of time, but you actually got stuff done because one activity didn't just expand and eat away your entire evening. Another nice thing about this is that you end up getting more done per minute, because the moment you put a deadline on something, it's a lot easier to focus on the task at hand, because oh, I don't need to spend, time and energy on this for an indefinite amount of period. I just have to focus on it for the next 60 minutes or whatever the time is that you pick. I found for me, for example, when I go to the gym and I tell myself I'm only going to be here 60 minutes, I then end up spending a lot less time in between sets scrolling on my phone or just kind of, daydreaming, because I know, okay, the clock is ticking. But now that we have an idea of the general direction we want to go in and how much time it's going to take us, we can now start figuring out how do we actually work that into our day-to-day schedules. Number 3, the daily highlight. So if you're anything like me, you might have noticed that whenever you try to fill in a to-do list, that to-do list starts getting pretty packed pretty quickly. And your motivation to get everything done on the to-do list might last a day or two, but by the time you get to day 5, there are a lot of unticked boxes on that to-do list, which ends up just kind of spilling over to the next day and the day after that. And so the cycle continues until you get to a point where you just feel extremely overwhelmed. Luckily, the authors Jake Knapp and John Saratsky provide a very clear solution for this in their book Make Time, specifically in the form of this idea called the daily highlight, which is that every morning you write down one thing that you would like to do that day and then make it your top priority for the day. You're not going to be able to tick off everything on your to-do list every single day, but if you at least have one very important thing that you prioritize and you manage to tick, then you can still look at that day as a success, even if there are leftover tasks, because at least you're putting the important stuff first. The daily highlight can literally be anything from getting coffee with a friend to going on a 20-minute walk. But one of the main requirements for the daily highlight is that it should be something that's not really tied to your day-to-day work. Because what you'll find is that when you make a bit of time every single day for the stuff that you care about outside of your work, then by the time you get to the end of a week, you would have done at least 7 things that you find interesting and that you really care about. And it's stuff like that that makes you feel like you're moving forward in life, but it also just keeps you happy and sane. So speaking of sanity, let's wrap this up with the 4th and final point. Number 4, 80% is good enough. I always found it interesting how in school, if you got an 80%, that would be a really good mark and you'd be really proud of yourself and you want to tell people about it. But the moment it comes to real life, when anything is only 80% of the way there or 80% as good as you wanted it to be, that suddenly feels like a failure. And the problem with this mindset is we can get into this loop of thinking, okay, well, if I'm going to work on this thing, but it's not going to be perfect or I'm not going to be great at it, then why bother at all? But a few years ago, I came across a piece of advice from the photographer Peter McKinnon saying that done is better than perfect. If you're always waiting for conditions to be perfect or for a project to turn out perfectly, then you'll either never get anything done or you'll never be satisfied. Life is messy, and life has no obligation towards us to make sense in the context of the goals that we're trying to achieve. But when you kind of tackle life with the mindset that this is normal and that things won't always go to plan, it makes it a lot easier to course correct and to keep moving forward. What I always try to tell myself at the end of the day, especially on the days when I didn't make as much progress as I wanted to, I can kind of take comfort in the fact that at least I still progressed, I moved forward, and I'm at least a little bit further ahead than the version of me that wouldn't have bothered at all. Productivity overall is just one of those words that gets thrown around a lot, but I think over the years I've come to appreciate that it's less about trying to outwork everyone else or to be as efficient as possible, but instead it's more about just making time for the things that you actually care about and working on the kinds of projects that you would like to see get done. So like I said at the start, we can all do with a little bit more productivity, but we don't necessarily need to lose our soul in the process. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.